Well, just a technicality, we are recording this event, so I hope you're comfortable with it. And Humanities and Social Change at Foscari University, we are very, very happy to hold this new event made possible by our colleague and board member, Francesca Tarocco, that I thank. And we are super honored and pleased to welcome Professor Ronit Yoeli-Tlalim and Professor Tim Barrett, who are our guests today and that are going to be introduced by Francesca. Doing the environmental humanities at Foscari is a very exciting activity because we are really at the crossroads of different disciplines, different perspectives. We are a center that has been focusing on the environmental humanities for the last few years, but that also enabled us to discover that many people had been doing environmental humanities at Foscari without really knowing it. And so in fact, they are simply, come together under this umbrella, and we are doing incredibly exciting transdisciplinary research. But one of the other distinctive traits is that unlike many other environmental humanities programs, we don't remain confined within the cultural boundaries of the West or simply in the, say, contemporary era. So we look much further back than the Anthropocene. So we are very, very happy that today is yet another important moment where we can explore also the connection with the medical humanities that is an important aspect and part of the environmental humanities. All right, so without further ado, I want to welcome you all and to give the floor to my friend and colleague, Professor Francesca Tarocco, who will introduce our guest and enjoy the conversation with all of you. Welcome.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. So I'm Francesca Tarocco, and I teach Chinese cultural and religious history here at Foscari University of Venice. And today's conversation, as you know, is based around Ronit Yoeli-Tlalim's important new book, ReOrienting, and we'll hear about that, Histories of Medicine, Encounters Along the Silk Roads. And we want to discuss the book and some of the fundamental questions it raises. And we have invited Professor Tim Barrett of SOAS to join us to have this, to give this conversation even a larger scope. So a few words about our wonderful speakers. Ronit Yoeli-Tlalim is reader in history at Goldsmiths, University of London. And she's the co-editor of a few interesting books. One is Rashid al-Din, Agent and Mediator of Cultural Exchanges in Ilkhanid Iran, 2013. Islam and Tibet, Interactions Along the Musk Routes, 2010, and Astro-Medicine, one of the first books, I think, to start this intellectual trajectory, Astrology and Medicine, East and West, 2008. Tim Barrett is an Emeritus Professor in the Department of Religions and Philosophies at SOAS University of London, and a leading scholar of medieval China. His research interests focus on the history of Chinese religion, notably Taoism and Buddhism, and pre-modern Chinese history in general, especially the Tang period. And he's the author of a number of pioneering studies, including the monographs Taoism under the Tang, Religion and Empire during the Golden Age of Chinese History, and The Woman Who Discovered Printing with Yale, 2008. And I want to thank our wonderful colleagues, like Charles said, colleagues and students of the newly launched master course in environmental humanities here at Foscari, which is the first of its kind in Italy. And I want to quickly add to cue on what Charles said, that today's dialogue, I think, marks for me the beginning of what I hope is a lengthy and fruitful engagement between those of us here and many other colleagues and students elsewhere who work on topics in the Asian environmental humanities, the global commons, and multi-directional interactions and knowledge across cultures, and the relationship between Asia, Europe, and the rest of the world. So today's conversation will revolve around some key questions covered in the book. And I will just put out a few there before asking Ronit to start by telling us how she came to write this book. So some of these questions are: how did knowledge move across Asia in the medieval period? What was the role of Buddhism in facilitating these transmissions? And how do we trace them? How do we trace these transmissions? So Ronit, first of all, please tell us a little bit how you came to write the book.
So first of all, thank you, Francesca and the organizers and Professor Tim Barrett for making this happen. I'm really delighted and honored to be a guest in the center. Yeah, a few words about how this came to be. I think I had a very unusual career trajectory. I did my PhD at SOAS, where I met Francesca. That was in Tibetan Buddhism. I worked on the Kala Chakra tradition, which intrigued me for a lot of different reasons, a lot of which I didn't deal with in my PhD, but I thought I need to have separate time to deal with. One of them was the connection with Islam that comes up in the text. The other one is the connection between Buddhism and medicine and the astral sciences, which is also in the Kala Chakra. So I moved on to, I was very fortunate to be able to raise a few large grants to deal with these different aspects. So the first step was a project that I initiated in the Warburg Institute, the Islam in Tibet project, where I worked together with Charles Burnett and Anna Akasoy. And we really started mapping this field. The relationship between Tibetan culture and Islamic culture. Years later, I found out that in the Tibetology circles, there was a lot of resentment to even thinking about that connection. Because traditionally, as you know, Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan studies more generally are linked with India, with Indian Buddhism, etc. And only later, even the connections with China began to be explored. But this idea that there would be anything to do with Islam was met with a lot of resentment.
What about now? Sorry to interrupt. I mean,
so apparently the book, the Islam in Tibet book. Wait, maybe I will share my. Oops. Can I share my screen?
Please. Maybe Barbara needs to allow you to do that.
No, it is already allowed. You should have no problems, I hope.
Okay.
Oopsie. Okay, share screen. Yeah. Can you see the? So this book, the Islam in Tibet book, where we really map the field, has now gained the appreciation it deserves. It's even in paperback. But if we speak later about resentments and overcoming resentments, this is one example of such a case. The project you mentioned earlier, the 3 books that came out of the project. So this is one of them. You mentioned the Rashid ad-Din book, which was one really interesting figure we came across during the project and thought was really worthwhile of further study. Again, someone that was somehow written out of history and didn't gain the attention he deserves. And the first one, the first book in the project, the Astro-Medicine project, which, unlike the further books and the further projects, was more about a comparative approach. So we often found that, you know, in kind of looking more generally at interactions and connections, sometimes just figuring out similarities is helpful as a first step, but it's only really a first step.
Yeah.
In terms of kind of how we get to think differently. So I think one important starting point is looking at maps and what maps tell us. And in the case of the Tibetan culture, when you just look at the map of the Tibetan kingdom, you can see that it's right by the Abbasid Empire. So you would think that it's almost obvious to think, okay, what kind of connections were there in terms of whatever, trade, culture, etc. And perhaps more interestingly is, why was this question not asked before? And perhaps we can come back to this question. Another kind of starting point, again, related to looking at maps, is the map from the Book of Curiosities that Yossi Appold, who was working with Emily Savage-Smith at the time on this very interesting Book of Curiosities, came to me when we were working in the during the Islamic Tibet project, came to me with this map, and yeah, we were really interested to find out that it mentions both something that appears to be the city of Lhasa, this Medina Tolhas over there, upside down, and the gate to China, the Babasine, and the mountain of Tibet. It's more legible. And this map is a map, as you can see, of connections. So perhaps a map that a trader would take, not necessarily a geography, but an itinerary. And so describing the route from Daibul, which is here. So perhaps a trader coming through the Indian Ocean to Daibul and heading to Tibet and China would take. So these kinds of maps led me to think about connections that are beyond the breakages that have evolved for different political and other reasons between cultures. So kind of beginning to break what I call in the book the cultural meridians. I was then really lucky to get another big grant from the Wellcome Trust and work alongside Vivian Lowe and the Dunhuang manuscripts, so the Tibetan medical manuscripts from Dunhuang. And again, Dunhuang, we can speak maybe later about center and periphery. So Dunhuang is perhaps a periphery when you look at Chinese studies, but it's really a really important center when you think about transmissions and we think about multilingualism and we think about Eurasia and we think about how knowledge, or how can we begin to uncover knowledge transmissions across languages, across cultures. So this focus on this fascinating group of texts, the medical Tibetan medical manuscripts from Dunhuang, and looking at the connections between other texts from Dunhuang was another really important step in the development. And again, when we look at the significance of working on texts from Dunhuang, when we think about the Eurasian expanse, is pretty evident when you look at the map, and then trying to figure out the small step changes that happen. So going step by step. Obviously, this is just what I do in the book is just a tiny little step in that direction. But when you look at what kind of transmission do we see happening as you look at the material from Dunhuang and Turfan, you already see what is happening in this big story of Eurasian transmissions. So some of the overall work that was the basis from which I started was also a collection, a conference or a kind of a workshop that I organized with Vivian Lowe and Susan Whitfield from the International Dunhuang Project, that came out in a special issue of Asian Medicine, Tradition and Modernity, that brought a group of people who've been working on Silk Road medicine. And then another fortunate project was my involvement in this project, the Entangled Itineraries with Kamala Smith in the Max Planck Institute, where we, again, working together with a fabulous group of scholars, we were able to look at how do we begin to make sense of the movement of knowledge and the movement of knowledge as entwined with materials and with practices. So these are some of the starting points that led to the book. There was another path that I've been working on in the last few years, which is the Hebrew Book of Assaf. It's a medical text that got me really interested because it mentions India a lot. And one of the first things I read about it suggested that it has links with Tibetan medicine. So I was completely intrigued by that. And then I started reading this text. And I found a lot of similarities especially in the narratives that it brings, but also in things like names of materia medica that I knew from Tibetan. And at the beginning, I was completely puzzled by that. But the book is the outcome of my attempts to figure out how could it be that we have these connections between an ancient Hebrew medical text and the ancient Tibetan medical text from Dunhuang. So maybe I'll stop now and we move to the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Tim, perhaps this is a good moment to start saying something about these entangled itineraries and ways of chopping up this big bit of land that you were saying.
Yes. Now, obviously I've known Ronit for some time, because many years ago she was a teaching assistant, and I was teaching, what was I teaching about, religions on the Silk Road or something? I can't remember.
It was called the Religions of East and Central Asia.
East and Central Asia, that's it, okay. um, uh, in SOAS, as the number of people in the humanities diminish, the range of their teaching has to expand. And of course, this is a very salutary experience for everybody to have to learn more and more, rather than sort of vegetate with the knowledge we've acquired during our doctoral studies. So I had to teach this course on both East Asia, which I'm relatively familiar with, and Central Asia, about which I knew nothing. So I started to really go back to my own origins in becoming interested in East Asia, which happened on my 16th birthday. That was in 1965. I had the kind of education that one gets in Britain, especially the more conservative sort of Victorian education with lots of Latin and Greek. And so I was familiar with things like the history of Alexander and so forth, which Ronit, in her book, in passing notices the Alexander romance getting as far as Mongolia. Extraordinary how it's, as well as materia medica, which form the theme of her own work, I'm also intrigued by the way that narratives, sometimes quite simple narratives, you know, animal stories and so forth, also manage to get around the entire landmass. But anyhow, I knew about Alexander. I knew at the age of 16 he was already somebody, but you know, what was I going to do? Well, it so happened my parents had a book on their shelves, which I can show you. It's called East and West by C. Northcote Parkinson. It's a really trashy book, but Parkinson was a trained historian who was teaching originally in what was then Malaya. He turned out to be quite a witty and incisive writer, especially on the topic of bureaucracy. He discovered Parkinson's law, which is still important, I think, not only to all bureaucrats, but certainly all academics. And Parkinson's law is this, which is work expands to fill the time allotted to it. And on the basis of this success, he gave up his job as a historian in what's now Malaysia and started to become a writer. And this was one of his sort of pot boilers. And it's about the ebb and flow of culture between East and West. His concept of what is East and what is West doesn't stand any degree of scrutiny. But what was revelatory to a 16-year-old was the fact that the East was mentioned at all. Remember the 1960s Britain and the 1950s in which I was educated were a post-imperial, post-colonial, but there was a very strong overhang of colonial thinking. The notion that Asia could have any agency was simply absent from all the teaching I received in school. Even in SOAS at the time, one of the staple courses taught in the history department at SOAS, which is supposed to be a specialist institution, was European activities in Asia. You know, because they were the ones that really counted. So the very idea that anything called Asia could have any agency was a revelation, and I decided.
Here we learned a lot about Jesuits, Tim.
Sorry?
Here we used to learn a lot about Jesuits. We still do.
Of course, yes, yes. Well, yes, that's a very interesting theme because, of course, the British self-image, largely English, was of gallant seafarers who, of course, were sworn enemies of the Counter-Reformation in particular, and were basically wandering around the globe conducting acts of piracy, which they you know, to the extent that they were able to loot Spanish galleons, were seen as a blow against the Counter-Reformation, you know, and conspiracies against the English crown and so forth. So that is how I became interested in the whole question of improving my knowledge. And it was a good opportunity, being told to teach Central as well as East Asian religion, to look again at the broader perspectives that had originally intrigued me. Ronit's book is really the kind of, Ronit is giving future readers the kind of education I wish I had from the start. You know, here at last we have somebody who is educated and self-educated in a way that you know, you can look at a manuscript from Dunhuang, and you can look at another manuscript from the Cairo Geniza, and you can see a relationship between the two. Neither of which was really visible from the point of view of a high school education in Britain that I went through, but surely must, in the interests of the international perspectives that are now necessary for our efforts to deal with the environment of the planet. To take a broader view. And I found the whole process of starting to take a broader view stimulating in many ways. It's interesting that I selected in particular an era in Chinese history which is popular in Britain, or had become popular during the previous century or so, the Tang, because the Tang was an extremely aristocratic society, which I think the British have some affinity for and Americans struggle with. And they're much better with the Sung, which is somewhat more meritocratic. But China too has always been seen as inward-looking. You know, sinocentrism is a palpable problem, although that hides a kind of plurality of perspectives that are not immediately obvious. To some extent, I'm coming to the conclusion China is what you see if you read Chinese. But of course, other languages were spoken in China. They're called minority languages now, but in times past, they were much more widely spoken. Not only that, but of course, Buddhism brought to China transcontinental perspectives that, if they weren't present before, were certainly introduced. The notion that China is not at the center of things, that we're all part of a larger continental perspective. We all live on the same world continent called Jambudvipa. And I found it interesting that this notion was certainly present amongst Buddhists in Tang times. Not only that, but although in theory it disappeared later, Buddhism allegedly became Sinified. Buddhism itself lost ground to more sinocentric perspectives. Even so, this isn't published yet, but it soon will be in a collection edited by Jonathan Silk. One finds in formal documents, things like vows and so forth, when the parties are identified in time and space with an exact date and with an exact place. That place is given not simply in terms of whatever place in whatever county, in whatever province in China, but also in Buddhist documents, Jambudvipa is mentioned, because of course there are other world systems and indeed other continents. So the conception of a broader landmass, of which China forms only a part, does survive in Buddhist texts. Not only that, but one finds in Buddhist sources a very intriguing cultural geography of ecology of Asia, which is common not simply to Chinese texts, but can be found in other texts very early on in Coptic, funnily enough, but also in Tibetan and other sources. And that is the concept of the four great rulers of the world. And they are the ruler of the horses in the north, who is clearly a nomad leader. The ruler of the multitudes in the east, who is the king of China, emperor of China or whatever, who of course in Chinese sources always said, well, he's obviously the best, you know? But the original conception quite clearly assigns no primacy to the king of the multitudes. The king of the elephants in the south, who is obviously an Indian ruler. And in the west, the king of riches, whether this is an Iranian or a Roman ruler varies somewhat according to the situation. And eventually, of course, there is a great king in Baghdad gets inserted into this scheme in Arabic sources. But generally speaking, these four great divisions of the Eurasian landmass are conceptualized quite clearly. In a number of sources, as I said, in different languages. This turns up, I would say, no earlier than the 3rd century CE, more like the 4th or even the 5th. And I think you can make a deduction about its origin. And that deduction is that whoever thought this one up didn't actually see themselves as being part of a world-dominating central power, but they may have been at the center. In other words, if you look at the center where these four quadrants intersect, what you're getting is somewhere in the region of Samarkand and Bukhara, where we know the merchants who operated across trans-Eurasian trade routes from very early on. That's where they tended to be, to find their home. Often they were Sogdians working in the Sogdian language. But maybe it could have been people from further south. I don't know. But I suspect the scheme is later than the Kushan Empire, which was at the center and could have, posed as the, the hub of Eurasia. But after it disappeared, I think we have to look to merchants as carrying with them a geography of the huge landmass across which they traveled and with which they were familiar. It made me think also about, since Ronit and I were both in a department of the study of religions at the time, what was the function of world religions like Buddhism or Islam or Christianity in relation to these networks and so forth. Now, the conventional wisdom is, and I think Ronit mentions it, and it's becoming clearer and clearer, that the religions followed the trade routes. And obviously the Buddhist monks or whatever hitch a ride with a caravan or with a merchant fleet sailing across the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. I wonder if that's the whole story.
Right.
Because you might look at it the other way around and say, these universal religions that address the human condition rather than the gods of the tribe, they great monotheistic religions or whatever, they make travel possible.
Right.
Because it means that the fear of dying away from home and the spirits of the ancestors is mitigated somewhat by the notion of a broader spiritual world in which you may meet your fate, you know, shipwrecked in the Indian Ocean or whatever. So I mean, there's a lot in Ronit's book that makes me extremely happy, and I could go on talking about for hours. The cultural history of materia medica, the fact that the things that travel are the low volume, high value substances like materia medica, spices, aromatics, and of course jewels and so forth. To try and write Eurasian histories of these substances, that Ronit has a chapter which really is starting to do this in a way that I found extremely interesting. The other chapters, you know, the representation of the body, for example, the key role of Rashid and the Ilkhanid as an area where one hops across meridians. And the one thing I've noticed some years ago in Cambridge, there was a Manichaean dictionary project, and looking at Manichaean text translated into Chinese, how the idea of the macrocosm and microcosm is translated literally, big world, little world. And you would have thought that the Chinese had ways of looking at the body that included the notion of the body as a landscape, which is an idea that's recently intrigued me because it involves the idea of travel. And yet, the translation is literal, big world, little world. And one remembers that, of course, in China, rather than a duality of macrocosm and microcosm, there is a trinity of heaven, earth, and man. That, you know, the human body is in between two different spheres. So it seems to me that this type of historical writing that Ronita exemplifies in the book. I mean, she says, well, I don't think anybody except me is going to read everything I write. Well, I sincerely hope that lots of other people read everything she writes, because this is clearly the way ahead. And I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to read what she said and react to part of it. I mean, obviously there's a lot more to be said, but perhaps I should leave that there for the moment.
Thank you, Tim. This was a really wonderful, and thank you for sharing also your, you know, adolescent desire to know more, and realizing that, you know, that there was definitely something wrong in what was being taught at the time, and clearly, you know, we are very much in this predicament. We realize here, you know, our own students very often, you know, although they do choose to study languages and so on, you know, come with, you know, very strong biases, which are, you know, of course, circulated in conventional media and social media and so forth. But going back to what you say, I find this idea of body as landscape, of course, I don't know if Ronit wants to say something about that, and also very intriguingly, you know, representations of the body, paper, how the use of paper you talk about a lot in the book, which is very important. So mapping and recipes, all of that. And the other thing that Tim suggests also, that religion, you know, world religion sort of allow travel to happen because of the possibility of you know, dying elsewhere as not damning or impossible for one's rescue, I guess. Yeah, the idea that, I guess, the corpse, you know, what to do with the corpse? How do you deal with the corpse? but yeah, paper, maybe Ronit, or do you want to talk about paper? Do you want to talk about, or maybe the things, also things traveling light? What is it that travels? That's something really important that you discuss. You know, what is it that travel? Practical knowledge, substances that travel.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you, Tim, for raising all these fascinating ideas. And I have to choose just one small element here. And also thinking about where we are, I mean, where this meeting is. So, okay, so one aspect that was really important for me to deal with in the book is first of all, how knowledge travels, why we know what we know, and why do we value that knowledge, and why do we not know the bits that we don't know.
Yeah.
So this is why you know, in every bit of the book, I also try to uncover those kinds of questions. And Francesca, you just mentioned the biases that students come with. So what I tried to do with the book, and that links into what Tim was just saying, is to think about the biases that I come with, the biases I approach, whatever I approach, and to kind of try to give some tools for people who read the book to break the narratives that we grow up with, the narratives that we approach history with, the narratives that the texts we study tell us to believe in. I mentioned earlier that, you know, the kind of the starting narrative of this Hebrew medical text that I was working on reminded me so much of the narratives that I found in Tibetan medical histories, of, you know, who the founding fathers are, and then what the connections are between how the tradition presents itself and what do we actually find in the tradition. And to find that there isn't necessarily an overlap between, you know, how a tradition presents itself and what it really is. And in that sense, medicine is or the history of medicine and medical humanities more general are a really good area to look at these questions. Also, stories and art are really good areas to look at these questions. They tend to be more hidden or difficult to find in religious narratives, because there's always an attempt from a religion to say, okay, this is only Buddhist. That can't be. It's not Islamic. Or you know, if you have the story of the life of the Buddha suddenly appearing in Islamic sources or in Jewish sources, then to shy away from Buddhists and create it as a Muslim story or as a Jewish story, etc. But religion is very important in the kind of material that I deal with, indeed as a carrier. So as a carrier of knowledge, as a producer of technology. Tim has written about print and in the Chinese context, and in the book I talk a lot about, well, I talk about paper as something that drives a certain kind of knowledge production. For example, of having text with illustrations, of democratization or popularization of knowledge. So what Vivian Lowe has called household medical knowledge. And then with regards to thinking more broadly about the materia medica, or the substances that people take to change whatever it is they want to change. I think it's really important, and again, this is relevant to the kind of work that you do in the center, is to look at the substance beyond its organic nature, but also to look at the whole conglomerate of the substance and the trade and the stories, and they are completely intertwined. So what your doctor tells you about the substance and the stories that you know about the substance have an effect on what the substance does to you. There's a really fascinating researcher at the Harvard Placebo Center, Dr. Ted Kapchuk, maybe some of you have heard of him. He started off as a practitioner of Chinese medicine, and people always say about Chinese medicine, oh, it's just a placebo. And his line was, maybe it's a placebo, but we need to remove the just out of it, because as they are researching in this placebo center at Harvard Medical School, placebos have an effect. Even if we leave that aside, my point in the way that I constructed the chapter on the Myrobalance is that we need to look at all these aspects together and in an interconnected Eurasian way, which is why I try to bring the Geniza and Dunhuang together.
Do you want to tell us a bit more about this connection between the Geniza and Dunhuang?
Maybe I'll just share a screen again and show you.
I also want to know more about the Coptic stuff that Tim just mentioned.
I just wanted to show this picture, these two pictures that I bring in the book. So everyone in Asian studies knows the picture on the left, Pelio in the Dunhuang caves, and everyone who works on anything to do with the history of the Middle East knows the picture on the right, which is Schechter looking at the Geniza documents. And what I wanted to do is bring those two together. Again, if we look at the map, and we looked before the map of the Indus River from Cairo. So the map of the Indus River brought us here, and the trade to the Indian Ocean brings us here to Cairo, where we find the Geniza material that with regard that I speak about in the chapter on the Myrobalance. So when we look at these Eurasian connections, so beyond the narratives and looking at some of the step-to-step connections that I try to trace in the book, I thought that it was very useful to see kind of the bigger picture and what kind of connections we can see between these two big hubs and these two cases of discarded histories. So these are all bits of history that are still not in the main narratives of what we know about Eurasian connections. We need to remember that they're still new. There's still a lot of those several tons of manuscripts that are still waiting to be studied. And similarly, a lot of these scraps from the Geniza are waiting to be studied, and they're both waiting to be put in the larger context. Some of this work is being done, and I saw Sam is here, so he's doing great, really fascinating work on the Tibetan material in that sense, and he can tell you more about that. Yeah, this is the idea in terms of trying to bring. It was just one case study of, I looked at one substance and a kind of a larger Eurasian history of that substance, linking these two sets of material. Stop sharing.
Thank you for this. Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, so your book is full of really interesting characters, both ancient and medieval and modern. And I wonder if you want to say a few words again, since we are here, right? I'm plunging myself back in time after years of studying modern Buddhism, and I now work on relics and glass. I mean, one can't resist the old stuff. So what about Marco Polo then?
Well, Marco Polo comes up a few times in the book, apropos several other themes. I mentioned before the narratives that shape the realities. So I talk about Marco Polo and the alchemical medical alchemy a bit, and his quote there about India being the place where people live a very long life, and yeah, and he talks about how they achieve that and so on. And what's interesting to note about the kind of information that he talks about, so how India is perceived in that sense, is how his report relates to previous what's called wonder literature. So some people call this kind of material, his material, as wonders verified. So it links to the material that I talk about actually in the first chapter, about this idea that knowledge comes from India. India as a source of knowledge, and India as a source of medical knowledge, India as a source of wondrous drugs, and how these all tie in and keep coming up and reappearing every time slightly different, in a different way. And then we have Marco Polo with his testimonies saying, or relating back to this kind of wonder literature, but then as an envoy, as a
witness.
As a witness. So this kind of testimony also lets us see how this kind of undercurrent of ideas feeds into his testimony, and more generally about this idea of India being the source of medical knowledge, and about wondrous drugs, which we can still see in popular culture or in Hollywood films as a recurring theme. India turning into more generally Asia. So Asia is where people live very long lives, and where their wondrous drugs come from, etc.
And perhaps teams want to say something. You want to say something about Taoists and longevity. Yeah, Marco Polo mentions sulfur and quicksilver. There's a lot going on in Taoist circles of that kind.
Yeah, Ronit also mentions the English connection with trans-Asian travel, slightly earlier than Marco, though not involving China directly, with William of Rubruck having a conversation with Roger Bacon. I think they met in Paris or somewhere, and Roger Bacon's ideas seeming to resonate very strongly with Taoist alchemy. Now, I did find, this is why I mentioned stories as well as substances. I did find when I was looking at translation of William of Rubruck by my friends Peter Jackson and the late David Morgan, that William sees a priest who's wearing a blood red robe, and he said, "No, that's very fancy," you know, because he's dressed like a friar, and you know, feels a bit outclassed by this. And the guy says, "Yes, it's monkey blood," through a translator, and we can trace this story. And we can be sure from the nature of this story that although a red robe usually often signifies a Tibetan monk, in fact, this is a imperially bestowed robe, and this is in all likelihood a Taoist priest with whom he was able to speak through an interpreter who had been captured by the Mongols from Hungary a long time before, and therefore could act as a translator. So he certainly had the opportunity to learn about Taoism. Now, when I presented this at a conference, one of the commentators said, "Oh, this is a bit of a weird story. Monkey blood, eh? This must have sounded quite bizarre." And of course, looking at it later, I don't think so, because dragon's blood, if you look at Marco Polo, dragon's blood, which is actually a plant that comes from Socotra and elsewhere, is a substance that is regularly traded. So if you're trading in dragon's blood, you're not going to think twice about monkey blood as a dye substance. So in fact, it's quite useful. And as I was explaining to you yesterday, my best souvenir from Venice is a book analyzing the trade goods that are mentioned by Marco Polo, because it's a very good way to check on what was going around Eurasia at that point, and to start to get some idea of the cultural history tied in with the material culture, as Ronit was talking about. And of course, one has to look, again, as Ted Kapchuk would say, and as she re-emphasizes, not simply at medical values, but of the value of that substance within a ritual context. Which was certainly in Japan, for example, in Shingon Buddhism, extraordinarily important. They were using aromatics of various sorts and other substances in Shingon rituals, but it was a combination of the ritual and the substance that was probably having some medical effect. So, you know, there's a world of excitement there that Ronit has opened up, and I just hope more people will be attracted to the to deal with the considerable linguistic hurdles that
Are necessary.
everybody has to overcome. I mean, I'm very glad that there are so many British people in Venice at the moment. I mean, we feel, you know, in our monoglot culture, we're so far behind. You know, all Italians speak at least 2 languages, one of which is Italian, and one which may be something very different, like Sardinian or whatever. You know, Venice is probably a good place in which to nourish the kind of trans-regional sensitivities and trans-regional linguistic abilities. After all, you've had Armenian in Venice for centuries, for example. And I sincerely hope that you know these efforts will prosper.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we want to say a few words more, or shall we open to questions from the floor?
Let's open to questions from the floor.
Yeah. Okay, everyone. If you want to switch on your video or post messages in the chat, both are fine with us. I know maybe Joseph wants to ask something on divination. Yeah, okay. I have a question from, I don't know which one first. Maybe let's have Joseph first and then Charles.
I think Shaul had his hand up first,
okay.
But yep.
Up to you.
Go ahead, Shaul. If you want to ask, I'll ask second.
I'll go ahead simply because the first things I need to do is to apologize because I ungraciously forgot in my keenness to listen to the speakers, the very precious cooperation of the Centro di Ricerca Marco Polo, the Center for Global Europe-Asia Connections from Foscari. That is one of the proofs of what Tim Barrett has just said, you know, about Venice being a great place, a great crossroads of civilizations in many ways. My question is a very sort of, you know, practical one. If one were to imagine to propose an exhibition to the museum in Venice, you know, that could sort of try to share some of these amazing narratives that pertain to specific fields, but have, as you pointed out, various ramifications from popular culture to modern narratives and perceptions of medicine, of Asian culture and such. Is there one object that you would choose to make the centerpiece, and that one could, you know, I've not read the book, so I've only read the introduction that you made available, and but I'm, you know, always fantasizing that, you know, one could start telling the story and sharing the story even for the non-experts through objects. Maybe, I don't know, maybe these objects are not something that you can easily have at your disposal, but so this is just a sort of, as I say, a flight of imagination. Imagine that you have to curate an exhibition that sort of illustrates your book, and you can choose one object, and what would that be?
Well, I would love to create an exhibition based on the material of the book. It'll have to have more than one object, though. Yeah, the whole, I think the whole premise of talking about connections that intertwine necessitate a few or many objects. But in terms of flashes of images that would be in that exhibition, so I would put the, you know, Pelio and Schechter looking at each other. That would be one. And in the I have it in the Myrobalan chapter. I have a medicine Buddha, a Tibetan medicine Buddha image holding a Myrobalan plant, and I would put it next to you know, the tripala that you can get in any health food shop, in any shop in Europe. Those two will be standing one next to each other, and we'd be explaining the connection between them. So but we might need a few more objects to explain this connection. So maybe in the section of the exhibition where we will be dealing with Marabalans, we will start with an image of the medicine Buddha holding a Marabalan, and we will finish with the, you know, the these modern packages of Tripala that you can buy in any health food shop, and try to explain how is it that it's, you know, still considered a super drug, a panacea, or what I tried to describe in this chapter, a construction of a panacea. Maybe we'll have some Marabalans also, or yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't give you one object, but I gave you a few.
What do you think, Tim? Yeah, it's a very
yes. That's a good choice, and Ronit's done a lot of work on it. What I would suggest, I hope this meets with some response. I would suggest a sheet of paper, but more than one, to illustrate the different modes of manufacture. Japanese paper, you know, washi paper, Chinese paper. There's a lot. On Tibetan paper making in this book by Hildegard Dienberger on Tibetan printing, which came out of a project a few years ago, including the collaboration of people who worked on Tibetan paper. Then, of course, paper from the Islamic world. And the whole book, Printing Before Paper, paper before printing, sorry, that Ronit draws on is a very rich source of material for that. So, and of course, yes, feel free to demonstrate, you know, the paper making resources of Venice as well, because Ronit's book brings out the centrality of paper to the transmission of knowledge, and at the same time, it shows the ability of that knowledge to be localized and for local improvisations to take the place of the originals. The plants used for making Tibetan paper are entirely different from the mulberry materials that are used in China, for example. So that's how I would set up the exhibition. Or another section of the exhibition. I'm sorry, our imaginations are running away with themselves. Perhaps I ought to stop.
If you mentioned Hildegard's book, there's an entire book dedicated to Tibetan paper by Agnieszka Hellman-Ważny, who looks at paper from Dunhuang and nearby sites, and also reconstructs the paper making. So certainly paper will be a section in this exhibition.
And of course, paper can also wrap things, as you quite right, you know, it wraps medicines. It can also be ingested, right? I mean,
yes,
there's a lot of that going on as well in terms of metabolizing, I guess, the
yes.
culture, eating culture, eating medicine,
eating ashes of paper,
eating ashes of paper
that have had Dharani written on them, for example.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, yeah. And Joe, what did you want? Joseph Sanza?
Well, thank you very much for this presentation. Very interesting. I must confess I'm somewhat of an outsider. I work on the late antique Mediterranean. But just a couple questions about what happens after the knowledge transfer. That's to say, how are these practices, medicines, objects, materials, etc., conceptualized after the fact? Are they considered exotic or foreign, or are they incorporated into the culture? And how does that change the cultures in which these practices have now come in? So anything about the kind of after effects and how those are kind of renegotiated within their new settings?
Thank you. That's a great question. And, you know, I think in the book, I touch only briefly on it because it's a very complicated question. But what I try to say in the book, that there are what I call knowledge that travels fast and knowledge that travels slow. So with regards, for example, to materia medica, we found this also with regards to Musk in the work that I did with Anna Akasoy, still within the Islam in Tibet project. So when you have Musk coming, for example, from Tibet into the Islamic world, what we found when looking at pharmaceutical texts, looking at these comparatively at the indications for the substance. So we did find a lot of similarities. So Musk is good for XYZ, found both in the Tibetan medical text and in Islamic medical text. So that kind of knowledge travels easily. But the theory behind it, why is it good for eye disease, it doesn't travel easily, because this is very much ingrained in religion and philosophy and ideas that don't move easily. So, you know, so if I have to give a brief response, practices, and I talk in the book also about, for example, moxibustion, so the burning or heating points alongside the body. And we can see that this is a practice that is found throughout Eurasia. And in some of the trail, the complicated trail, we can trace transmission. But again, the transmission is about the practice and not the theory behind the practice. So yeah, this is a short answer to a very complicated question.
Are they ever ethnically coded? Like, this is a practice we got from such and such, and that's why it works, because there's some kind of exotic knowledge associated with it, or?
So sometimes there is, and I bring one example when I talk about the possible transmission of moxibustion or cauterization into the Western Turkic lands, so into Anatolia, for example. There's evidence there that he says one Tatar doctor came and showed me this, and so sometimes we have it. And again, this brings this question of who do we trust? So is it if some doctor from a land that you consider that you, let's say, respect their culture, tells you, okay, I tried this, I did this is what we do in my land, and there is documentation of that, then that yeah, there are texts that have that kind of testimonies. Yeah, and then there is, more generally, this sometimes we find evidence of saying, oh, this practice comes from that a particular culture, and giving that particular culture value in quoting that particular practice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tim, would you like to say something?
Yes. What I find interesting is the sort of etiological stories that explain cultural imports. What you do is you associate them with somebody, a well-known traveller. So Marco Polo brings noodles to Venice. Cats are imported by the Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang because the cats keep the rats at bay from eating the Buddhist scriptures. Even today, you get urban myths that grow up in this way. Like there's a flock of parakeets in South London, and people say, oh, they escaped from some that Jimi Hendrix had, and there are sort of a flock of parakeets in Palo Alto as well. I noticed, and maybe that's Jimi Hendrix as well. I don't know, but it seems that yeah, there are ways of rationalizing the exotic. There are other ways too. For example, in the 2nd century CE, a new type of flute was imported from the West. Now, how do you domesticate that? Well, you say, well, Lao Tzu, the alleged founder of Taoism, is last seen traveling westward. Maybe it's something he invented there, and it's really Chinese, and we're just, you know, it's okay to accept this new flute. It's a Chinese invention that happened to take place elsewhere. So these rationalizations actually would form quite a large study, but it's certainly an area you are absolutely right to focus on.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it happens a lot with musical instruments, as Tim quite rightly said. It happens a lot with musical instruments, which are some of the most complex, technologically complex, and expensive things to make, you know, in those days. Heather, you have a question.
Yes, I think my question continues on this etiological discussion pretty well. So when you showed the two pictures of the piles of papers juxtaposed together, I thought of Abby Warburg's Damascene Atlas, and how that, and a lot of the kind of early 20th century thoughts about humanity and tradition and culture and stuff sort of posits that there's an originary ancient culture, which seems like too good to be true, like that there's a single source. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about, like, you know, I don't know, the original culture, or yeah, if it's a circuit or what. Yeah, just curious.
Thank you.
Interesting question.
Yes. So first of all, I mentioned about the Astro-Medicine book that talks about comparisons, and sometimes comparisons are a good starting point to bring up the material. And I have to say that the what was it, 2 years that I spent in the Warburg Institute, that is, you know, organized, the library, heavenly library, is organized in a way that brings up connections. So for example, you have the Astro-Medicine shelf, and you have all the cultures there represented together. But this started 100 years ago or so, this way of thinking. I think, okay, so that was a good starting point. Okay, first of all, let's look at these things together. And then I think where we are now is that we've moved from roots to roots. So from roots with double O to roots with OU. And I think, yeah, there has been a move away from this idea of original, whatever, original Buddhism, original, and the original was always considered the pure and all that jazz. And I think we've moved away from that. Having said that, so there's, I think, generally the move from roots to roots. But having said that, I have a scholar friend, Mark Geller, that I mentioned in the book. So he works on Babylonian stuff. And I always like to run things by him. Do you have that? And I mean, we have to look also at some kind of temporal organization of things. So it's always interesting to see what they have in their sources. And again, the amount of sources that have been studied in relation to the vast texts that are still not studied is mind-boggling. And so there's, if you're any students around that are considering which languages to study, so think about the languages that less people study, because there's more text to be read. Study the languages that no one in your neighborhood has heard about. I was asked what my advice for graduate students is. So this is one of them. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
We should do that open day. That the kids to study Syriac.
Yes.
Tim, would you like to say something to that whole issue of origins?
Well, it moved, the question is a very good one. It moved me on to think about those sort of glorious days of the 19th century when people were looking for origins and things like that. The lost Hungarian who founds Tibetan studies whilst looking for the origins of the Hungarians, for example. But one can also see that the people of those days, when they start to talk about origins, they're really only talking about themselves. Even the very idea of a Silk Road, what does it do? It legitimates looking at Asia by relating it to classical Europe. Well done, that German baron, people didn't think about Asia like I didn't until I was 16. And by saying Silk Road, it legitimates some interest in an area that had simply been ignored up to that point. So I find now we're at some distance. I can remember my great-grandmother, who was born, in the 1860s. But we're now at such a distance that we can really look at them historically and see the cultural circumstances that molded their lives and their ideas in a more objective way. And I think we have to do so explicitly, because we have implicitly inherited a lot of things from then that really we ought to think about more carefully. Yeah. So thanks.
Yeah, and I mentioned in the book also exactly the same thing about Oral Stein, that his motivation to go to Central Asia and to get the Dunhuang material that was the basis for the book is also to find these connections with Europe, and to find the connections with Europe was, in the grand scheme of things, a colonial enterprise. So we have to think also about, why, this is what I said in the beginning, to think about why do we have the sources that we have, to think about the origin stories of, these expeditions. Even he was looking for connections between Europe and Asia. So yeah, these the stories, the motivations that lead to ultimately finding the materials that we base ourselves on. It's really important. And I also talk about it in the chapter where I talk about the Bauer manuscript, where, you know, the whole reason why Captain Bauer was there was because of of colonialism, and because he it didn't just happen by chance that the whole beginning of the search for manuscripts began. So we also have to look at that. And there's still, you know, so many caves that nobody has found with so many texts that are still waiting. And then, you know, in China they find them all the time. So this idea of why do we study the stuff that we study is always a really important one to think about.
Absolutely. Any more questions? Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with the issue of agency, and I think that's probably still. I mean, you know, this is just a throwaway comment, but you know, COVID, global capitalism are showing us that you know, I don't know, that Asia still is not the world, right? In many ways. Yeah. You are editing a volume on COVID, Ronit. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm editing a special issue of Asian Medicine, the same one I showed you that we did. It was a special issue on medicine along the Silk Roads. So this special issue will be on Asian responses to COVID-19, both looking from a historical perspective and anthropological perspective, and again thinking about the medicine in its multiplicity. So along the lines of what medicine is. We have a contribution. I see one of our contributors here, William Mcgrath, who has brought a really interesting text. Yeah, so we need to think as these things again as interconnected, both geographically and beyond what we tend to fence in this term medicine. So they're related to ritual, and they're related to religion, and to well-being in a more general way of thinking about that. And again, that ties in, I think, with the mission of what the center is trying to do in thinking about medical humanities and environmental humanities more globally.
Thank you. Maybe this is too late in the day, but I have one final big question.
Big question.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Okay, I'll make it smaller. We leave the big question for another day. But so it's sort of why medicine? I guess why? I mean, could we call this something else? I don't know. Why do we need to call it medicine? Like what you have in the book. I mean, is it material culture, is technology, or?
Well, I'm not sure this is what you're after, but I said earlier in passing that I think medicine is an area that has so many aspects that come together, that intertwine, and also that are pan-human, in a way that makes it a really interesting field to look at these bigger questions. So you could also yeah, I think that's one side of the question. I think maybe you're also aiming towards, maybe we should call it something else. Maybe it's we should be looking at not just medicine. And then again, it's really complicated to do this kind of work. I look at, I mentioned somewhere in the beginning that well, some of these stories have only left traces, and it's really difficult to find those traces. And first of all, we have to start somewhere, and I think medicine is a really good starting point for medicine to reach out to some of these other ideas that are more maybe cultural or environmental, looking also at things like art and stories, narratives, and things like that. But in a way, they're all entangled, and they're all part of the puzzle. So, and I think there needs to be a lot of us doing this kind of work, because even, I didn't say this, but none of this, all of this was a result of me being parts of a lot of group projects, and none of it could be done alone. And so we need to be working in groups. We need to be working in projects that bring a lot of skills together.
Yes.
And also bringing the different areas of inquiry together, because the kind of material that I brought here and the kind of questions that I bring in the book can also feed into other areas, and other areas can feed back into the study of histories of medicine, but also these other fields.
Some fields which are perhaps more recent as well, right? Like food studies, for example.
Like, sorry?
Food studies.
Yeah. I mean, food is certainly an area that falls within medicine, and there's great work being done on food, the transmission of food. And then they all have to, they all form a piece of this huge puzzle, which we are yet to make.
Tim, would you like to say something? Comment?
Yeah, I think medicine's quite handy, at least provisionally. Everybody knows that the boundaries here are porous, and people are starting to look at the boundaries a bit more carefully. I'm thinking of Michael Stanley Baker and his work on Taoist medicine, which you know, very problematic term. But at the same time, I remember Chris Cullen saying that medicine was one of the few areas, if you're talking about early China, where you can actually identify it as specialization in a way. You know, there were no philosophers in early China. Nobody called themselves. There is no word for philosopher as such. All the categories. I mean, there were categories, but they're not recognizable to us. But medicine is, at least in a provisional way, and it's a good provisional starting point.
And that's and also kind of ritualist and stroke, you know, healers.
Yeah, or well-being in a more extended sense. When we were talking earlier about medicine and divination, you know, absolutely fascinating the Ronit's description of dice being used to find out, you know, unknown disease factors or whatever. I mean, what the Tang physician would do, would he'd actually have a séance and you know, find out that way what about diseases. And equally, as I pointed out, in the 17th century, Buddhists were using dice to find out about their karma. As I mentioned, you know, you can also use playing cards to discover things about, you know, knowledge of the unseen, you know, fate and fortune. There's a long way we could go, obviously, but we won't.
Tim is making fun of my surname.
Not fun, proposing the new project.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions? This was absolutely wonderful, and thank you, Ronit and Tim, for doing this with us. And I really hope to have you, you know, in Venice for number 2 or a new project, indeed. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming today. And we see you soon.